There is a clay tablet sitting inside a temperature-controlled case in the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. It is roughly the size of a hardcover book. The edges are chipped. 3 sections of the original surface are missing. It was unearthed at Nippur in the late 19th century during a joint excavation funded by several American universities, and it was logged, catalogued, and then placed in the collection alongside thousands of other tablets recovered from the same site. For decades, it was considered a secondary administrative text, a scribal record. The kind of thing cuneiform scholars examined once, noted as broadly religious in character, and set aside for later study. That later study came in fragments. One translator worked on a section in the 1940s. Another looked at the third column in the 1970s. A third scholar published a partial interpretation in the early 1990s and noted in a footnote that the passage in question contained vocabulary that did not fit neatly into any known Sumerian literary category. That footnote is where this story begins. Because what that translator noticed was that a specific set of cuneiform signs in the lower half of the tablet's second column did not match the vocabulary of temple ritual, administrative recording, or mythological poetry. The signs described something that looked, in his words, more like a final instruction set, a closing message. The language was direct, in a way that Sumerian religious texts rarely are. It named a recipient, it named a location, and it described the last known exchange between the god Enki and a specific human being at the end of the period Sumerian sources call the time before the Great Change. Not a prayer, not a hymn, not a list of offerings, a conversation. Recorded in clay, and the human in that conversation was not a king, not a priest, not a temple official. According to the tablet, this person had been sought out by Enki specifically, chosen because of what they already knew. And the exchange that followed contained something that the scribes who recorded it apparently considered too significant to leave to memory alone. That is why it was pressed into clay. Most people who encounter the Sumerian corpus for the first time assume that all the gods in those ancient texts are the same kind of entity, distant, cosmic, symbolic. That Enki and Enlil and Ninhursag exist on the same level as the Greek gods, functioning as narrative devices for explaining natural phenomena. Thunder, rain, the flooding of rivers, the rising of grain. That reading misses something important. Enki in the Sumerian texts is not a symbol. He is a technical entity, a problem solver. He appears in the literature, not delivering vague cosmic decrees, but engineering specific outcomes. He creates the Lulu Amelu, the primitive worker, by mixing divine essence with clay and blood. He designs the irrigation systems of the Tigris and Euphrates in the Sumerian mythological literature with the specificity of a hydraulic engineer. He builds the Abzu, his underwater domain, as a working facility, not a decorative realm. And when humanity faces extinction in the flood narrative, it is Enki who finds a technical solution. Not because he disagrees with the council's decision in principle, but because he calculates that something must survive. What must survive, and why, is the deeper question. In the main Sumerian creation narrative, humanity was made for one purpose: to take over the labor that the lesser Anunnaki, the Igigi, had grown unwilling to perform: the digging of canals, the processing of grain, the management of the Earth's surface resources. The Sumerian word used for this arrangement is a compound term that translates roughly as those who carry the burden. Enki designed the first human template to fit this function. The Lulu Amelu was created capable enough to follow instruction, to retain simple procedural memory, to organize into groups and complete assigned tasks. And critically, it was created with cognitive limits deliberately built in. The Anunnaki Council, particularly Enlil, was specific about this. What was created must not exceed its function. It must not accumulate knowledge beyond what its labor role requires. Enki agreed to those parameters, and he built accordingly. But Enki was a record keeper, as well as an engineer. The Sumerian literature describes him maintaining what are called the Tablets of Destiny in his own archive, separate from the Great Tablet maintained by the Council. His archive contained things the Council's record did not: older information, pre-flood technical data, astronomical measurements from periods before the current human age. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I am about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete decoding of all 12 passages on this tablet, the cuneiform references, the translated sections, the astronomical markers that date these events to a specific degree of the ecliptic, I put it all into a written document. It is linked below, and the QR code is on your screen right now. Now let us continue. and something the texts describe using a Sumerian term that translators have wrestled with for over a century. The term looks, in one reading, like a word for seed. In another reading, it appears closer to a word for lineage. And in a third possible reading, which was noted by only one scholar and then largely ignored, it may describe something closer to a carrier of retained instruction. That third reading is what the Nippur tablet appears to be about. The tablet does not begin with Enki. It begins with a location. The signs describe a place the text calls the edge of the water district, which scholars have mapped to the boundary region between the settled agricultural zone and the marshland system in southern Mesopotamia. This was not a populated area. It was peripheral, the kind of place that does not appear in administrative records because nothing is being administered there. And that, the tablet seems to suggest, is the point. Enki did not want witnesses. The human is introduced in the second section of the tablet with a designation that has no clean parallel in other Sumerian texts. The word used is not the standard term for a common person, not the designation for a temple servant, not the title of a king or official. It is a compound sign that appears to combine the cuneiform elements for one who holds and one who was given. The most literal rendering a translator could offer would be something like the designated holder, and the designation did not come from a temple. According to the tablet, it came from Enki directly. This was not a random encounter. This was a scheduled transmission. What Enki said first, according to the tablet's third section, was a statement about time. The Sumerian signs translate roughly as, "The count of days I was given has reached its last number." This is a phrase that appears in no other Sumerian text in exactly this form. It does not appear in the flood narratives. It does not appear in the temple hymns. It does not appear in the administrative literature. It is unique to this tablet, and it describes Enki not as a god delivering a timeless decree, but as an entity who understood that his own operational period in direct contact with humanity was ending. He was not disappearing. He was withdrawing. And before that withdrawal, he had one specific thing to transmit. The tablet's fourth section is where the damage becomes significant. Two large fragments are missing from the surface, and what remains is enough to reconstruct the general structure of the passage, but not every word. What survives describes Enki giving the designated holder what the text calls the full account. This phrase, the full account, appears in Sumerian as a combination of signs, meaning the complete record from before and the correct order of what follows. It is not a mythological narrative. Based on the surrounding vocabulary, it reads more like a transfer of structured technical information. The kind of information that would need to be carried forward by a person who could understand it and transmit it intact. The translator, who first flagged this passage in the 1990s, wrote in his notes, which were later made available through the university's archive, that the passage reminded him less of religious literature and more of a detailed oral briefing. The kind that would be given to someone who was about to travel somewhere their instructor could not follow. That framing matters. Because after the full account is delivered, the tablet describes the human's response, and the response is not worship. It is not gratitude in the standard formulaic Sumerian expression. It is a question. The designated holder asked Enki why the information had been given to them specifically, and Enki's answer, preserved in the fifth section of the tablet, in some of the best preserved cuneiform on the entire surface, is the most studied passage in the document by the handful of scholars who have worked on it seriously. The answer uses three distinct Sumerian phrases. The first phrase translates as, "because you were shaped for this before the others knew the design." The second phrase translates as, "because what you carry cannot be destroyed by the water, or the fire, or the long silence." The third phrase is the most difficult. Scholars have offered three distinct translations, none of which are fully satisfying. One translator gives it as, "because they will need to find you when the count begins again." A second translator renders it as, "because you are the record they will search for when the forgetting is almost complete." A third, working from a different reading of one sign, offers, "because you hold what the next age requires and does not yet know it is looking for." All three translations say the same thing in different ways. Enki was not speaking to a human who would be remembered. He was speaking to a human who was designed to be found. The question that has occupied the small number of researchers who have worked seriously with this tablet is not whether the passage is authentic. The cuneiform is period consistent. The signs match the late Uruk to early dynastic scribal style. The clay composition analysis places it within the Nippur site's established stratigraphy. The authenticity is not in serious dispute among the scholars who have examined it directly. The question is what it means that a text like this exists at all. Because the standard framework for understanding Sumerian religious literature assumes a specific relationship between gods and humans in those texts. The gods are powerful, the humans are subordinate, The communication moves in one direction. Humans pray, offer, petition, obey. The gods deliver oracles through intermediaries, through dream visions, through the controlled channel of the temple priest. Direct one-on-one transmission of information from a god to a non-royal, non-priestly human being at a remote location, off the record, does not fit that framework. This tablet describes exactly that. And when you place it alongside 3 other documents from separate collections, a pattern begins to form that is difficult to explain within the conventional framework. The first parallel document is a fragment held in the British Museum, recovered from the site of Ur, and catalogued as part of the city's secondary scribal archive. This fragment, significantly damaged, contains a passage describing what the cuneiform calls the ones who were given the weight of words before the leaving. The phrase weight of words in Sumerian carries the specific connotation of preserved information, the kind of information that must be held and not lost. And the phrase before the leaving is a temporal marker that appears in flood narrative contexts, specifically in the period immediately before the flood event begins. Before we move on to what happens next, stop for a second. What you just heard about the categories of knowledge Enki transmitted to the designated holder is the part that changes everything. But it only makes full sense when you see the original Sumerian signs written out next to the translated interpretation. The cuneiform for the deep record. The sign combination that describes the living design. The astronomical measure phrase, and the 3 competing scholarly readings. It is all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The second parallel document is an Akkadian language tablet found at Nineveh in the same collection as the Gilgamesh flood narrative. It describes what it calls the instruction of Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki. Most translators have read this as a ritual instruction for maintaining a sacred lineage. But an alternative reading proposed at the Oriental Institute in the mid-1980s suggests the text describes not a ritual lineage but a knowledge lineage. Information passed from a designated holder to a designated holder across generations using a transmission method the text calls one who teaches the next before the first is gone. Not a priesthood, not a temple, not a line of priests performing inherited ceremonies, a relay. The third parallel document comes from the pyramid texts, among the oldest religious writings in the world, inscribed on 5th dynasty royal tombs in Egypt. Within those texts, one passage describes a group of beings placed among humans but not made the same way. Beings who carry what was given before the counting of days began. The Egyptian, Sumerian, and Akkadian texts are not copies of each other. They emerge from different cultures, different time periods, different scribal traditions. And yet all 3 describe the same structural idea, a transmission from a higher technical intelligence to a specific set of human receivers, carried forward through time by a designated line of holders, waiting for a moment of recovery. That recovery is what the Nippur tablet's final section appears to describe. The closing passage uses a Sumerian term from flood narrative contexts, meaning the resurfacing after the water recedes. But here the term is not applied to land or civilization in that sense. It is applied to knowledge. The text describes what the designated holder carries as something that will resurface, not immediately, not within a single generation, but at a specific point described using astronomical signs the tablet's damaged edge can no longer show. What remains legible is the direction. The knowledge will resurface when the count reaches a number the tablet can no longer show. And when it does, those who carry it will not know at first that they are carrying it. That line has no clean parallel in any other Sumerian text. The content of what Enki transmitted is the hardest part of this tablet to interpret, not because the cuneiform is unclear, but because the categories of knowledge it describes do not map cleanly onto anything in the conventional historical record. The first category combines signs for measure and the boundary between sky and earth. Most translators render this as astronomical knowledge. Astronomical knowledge is stable across time, in a way political or social knowledge is not. If you know what the sky looked like at a specific moment, you can transmit that to someone 500 years later and it will still be accurate. The second category combines signs for the shape of water movement and the deep record. One reading suggests hydraulic knowledge, fitting Enki's role as hydraulic engineer. But a second reading proposes the phrase describes not water systems, but the pattern that the deep record follows, a structural principle more fundamental than engineering. The third category translates consistently as the account of what came before the first count. Knowledge from a period before the current human age, before the flood, before the Anunnaki assembly in its current configuration. In other Sumerian texts, this phrase is treated as mythological framing. In this tablet, it appears as a discrete item in a transmission list. Enki was not giving the designated holder mythology, he was giving them a record. The fourth category combines signs, meaning the design, the living, and the number that was used. The phrase most literally reads as the design specifications of the living that used the original count. This appears to describe a biological record, the parameters of the original human template, the numbers, ratios, and structural decisions that went into the design of the Lulu Amelu as Enki originally built it. The designated holder was not expected to use this information immediately. The holder was expected to carry it, to be a living archive, not to act on what they knew, but to preserve it, transmit it to the next holder in the chain, and wait. The tablet's closing signs use the Sumerian word for the moment when what was below returns to the surface. In astronomical application, that describes the heliacal rising of a star. The moment when a star invisible below the horizon finally reappears in the pre-dawn sky after a long absence. Enki was not describing a political event, he was describing a timing mechanism. The knowledge transmitted would remain below the surface, carried by the designated line without their understanding of what they carried, until the astronomical moment arrived when it was meant to resurface. The fragment containing the astronomical specifications is gone. The signs on the damaged edge cannot be read, but the direction remains. The knowledge resurfaces as the count begins again. There are researchers who have spent years trying to identify whether the designated holder corresponds to any named individual in the broader Sumerian literature. The Sumerian texts are thorough in recording named individuals who receive divine communication. The designated holder has no name in this tablet. If a name was ever present, it is in one of the missing fragments. One possibility is that the name was deliberately omitted, that Enki specifically requested the record be kept nameless to protect the transmission from interference. Enlil does not appear in this tablet. The Council of the Anunnaki does not appear in this tablet. The exchange is between Enki and one human, in a place no one was watching, at the end of a period Enki understood was closing. The Sumerian literature shows a consistent pattern of tension between Enki and the Council, particularly Enlil. The pattern is remarkably consistent across centuries of Sumerian literary production. Enki repeatedly acts in ways that exceed or circumvent what the Council authorized. The creation of the primitive worker, the warning given to the flood survivor, the second creation, hidden from the Council entirely. And now, a final transmission, at a remote location, with no witnesses, at the moment of his withdrawal from direct contact. All of these actions share a structural feature. They are all instances of Enki preserving something the Council did not authorize to be preserved. Whether the Sumerian scribes were describing a god who occasionally made independent decisions, or recording something they observed and could not fully explain, the behavior is consistent. A technical intelligence operating on a longer timeline than the Council it nominally served. The flood was coming. Enki knew. The Council knew and chose to allow it. Enki preserved a survivor anyway. The current human age was closing. Enki made a final transmission anyway. The pattern holds. And if it holds, then what Enki was doing was not rebellion. He is portrayed as a calculator, an entity that processes available information and identifies optimal outcomes, sometimes in ways the hierarchy above him has not yet recognized as necessary. The transmission to the designated holder was a calculated preservation, the same logic that saved the flood survivor, the same logic that maintained the separate archive in the Abzu. What needed to survive was a structured record about the design of humanity, the pattern of the deep record, the account of what came before the first count, and the astronomical measure of when the current age would end. He gave that record to a human being who would not understand its full significance. And he told that human being that they had been shaped for this before the others knew the design. The tablet ends there. The closing signs are formulaic by Sumerian scribal convention. But in this context, the formulaic closing carries a different weight than it does at the end of a grain inventory or a temple hymn. The designated holder walked away from the edge of the water district, carrying something they had not carried before, something Enki had calculated they were built to hold. Something designed to survive the water, the fire, and the long silence. There is one detail in the tablet's 5th section that no translator has fully resolved. In the middle of Enki's answer to the designated holder's question, before the 3-part response about why this human was chosen, there is a short phrase of only 4 Sumerian signs. All 3 translators treated it as a grammatical connector, a transitional phrase, the kind of thing you skip past to get to the substantive content. But one of those translators added a note in his working papers, not in the published article, that this 4-sign phrase, when read with the sign values that apply to its specific archaic form, does not function as a transition at all. It is a statement. And the statement in his provisional rendering is this: "You will not remember that you remember." 4 signs, 1 sentence. And if the reading is correct, it reframes everything in the tablet. Because it means that Enki did not transmit his record to a holder who would consciously know what they were carrying. The transmission was structured to be held below awareness, carried without knowledge of carrying. Preserved by people who would not know they were preservers, until the count begins again. The Nippur tablet is cataloged, it is accessible. The scholars who worked on it published their findings in journals that are still in university libraries. The notes are in archives that researchers with the right credentials can request. Nothing here is hidden in the sense of being locked away. It is hidden the way most things in the ancient record are hidden, sitting in a case, in a collection, with a catalog number and a brief descriptive tag that does not come close to describing what it actually contains. The last human Enki spoke to was not a king, was not a priest, was not a person of standing in the administrative structure of early Sumerian civilization, was a person who had been shaped, according to Enki's own words, before the others knew the design. A designated holder, a living archive, someone built to carry a record they would not remember carrying. And what Enki asked them was not to remember, not to act, not to teach, immediately, or to build, or to lead. He asked them to hold, to transmit, to wait for the moment when the count begins again, and the knowledge, like the star returning to the pre-dawn horizon, rises back into visibility. Whether that moment is past, present, or still approaching is a question no damaged clay tablet can answer completely. But the tablet exists. The transmission was recorded. And someone, 4,000 years ago, thought what happened at the edge of the water district was important enough to press into clay and preserve. That decision alone tells you something about what they understood to be at stake.